clinical researcher, so I have two roles. One is to do research in the laboratory, and the other is to work with patients in the NHS. And so I combine those roles. I'm an infectious diseases specialist, and I particularly specialise in viruses and emerging viruses, which is my particular interest. I've been involved with a variety of aspects of COVID-19 research in the last 2 years. One of these aspects has been running the vaccine trials in NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde. So I've been the principal investigator locally for the local population in Glasgow and Clyde, for the Oxford vaccine trial, for the Novavax vaccine, for Valneva, and for booster vaccines. So there's a trial called Cov Boost, which is all about giving people a third or a fourth dose of vaccination with some of the other vaccines, including Moderna and Pfizer. So we've really worked with all of the available vaccines in Glasgow. So SARS-CoV-2, which causes COVID-19, is a virus which is a SARS virus. And you might have heard of SARS-1, which caused a really nasty outbreak in 2003 in various countries, and also emerged from China. And SARS-CoV-2 is a sort of cousin of that virus, and it causes severe pneumonia, particularly in people who are vulnerable. And the people that are most vulnerable are people who are older. That, in fact, is the biggest risk factor. So you might be normally very fit and well, but 75. And if that's the case, then your risk of developing really severe pneumonia with COVID-19 is actually very, very high. And if you're even older than that, it's much higher. So in Glasgow, we've been tracking what's been happening with COVID-19 in Glasgow. And we know that if people who are unvaccinated and over the age of 90, the risk of hospitalisation or death is something like 75% in people who are much older. And people who are very young, the risk is really quite small. So from the age of sort of middle age, in 40s and older, the risk gets steadily higher. And so vaccination has been really important to prevent severe pneumonia as a result of infection with this virus. There are actually other side effects of the virus as well, which vaccination also prevents. But really bad pneumonia affecting both lungs is the presentation that we've very commonly seen in the hospital. I think vaccination has actually been one of the most remarkable events of my medical career. So I started working in the National Health Service in 1990. And this has been one of the most sort of landmark moments for medical science and for changes in medicine that have helped people substantially. And we know that probably millions and at least hundreds of thousands of lives have been saved by vaccination. One of the most fundamental things that we've been able to address during this pandemic has been the bit that comes first, the funding and the paperwork that comes with setting up a trial for vaccines. So that has been really speeded up, and the time taken for that has been really compressed. But the speed at which we've carried out the trials has been at the same pace as for other medicines. So actually that hasn't been faster. That's actually been at the same speed, because you can't speed that bit up. You actually have to wait and see how people are with the vaccine. You have to test how well it works. You have to see how many people who've been given no vaccine versus people who've been given vaccine, how many of them get infected, and that takes quite a bit of time. And so the follow-up for patients in the trials has not been speeded up. But what has been speeded up is the manufacturing process of the vaccines, the money injected into the development of these vaccines, and the bureaucracy, the committees that need to review the papers and so on, received more funding. And so they were able to deliberate and consider the vaccines and the trials more quickly. I think you might be aware that, for example, with influenza, we update vaccines every year. So we can predict which variants of influenza we might get in the UK by what's going on in Southeast Asia, particularly in Australia. And what tends to happen there tends to come to us about 6 months later. And so we actually design our vaccines based on what's going on over there. With COVID-19, it's a similar situation in that the virus does evolve over time. It changes shape, and we have these new variants arising quite commonly. So we're getting ones which dominate maybe 2 or 3 times a year. And then, of course, there are actually hundreds of different variants circulating in different parts of the world all the time. Some of these are more able to persist and do well in populations, and so they become the ones that we want to vaccinate against. And mutation is a concern with SARS-CoV-2, and the reason it happens, it's the same with all viruses, is that when viruses divide, the genome of the virus, so the blueprint, the genetic blueprint of the virus, which is responsible for everything. So we have DNA inside us, which has the recipe for how we are, how we look, our, whatever, everything about us actually probably is defined, at least in part, by our genes. It's very similar with the virus. And actually, we are able to sequence the virus, meaning that we can predict, looking at the sequence data, whether or not vaccines are likely to be affected by changes in the virus. And that's been something that the UK has actually led on internationally in the last 2 years as part of something called the COG UK consortium, which has gone on here in these laboratories. We've been sequencing the virus for Scotland, and we've done many tens of thousands of sequences of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. We're actually able to take the genetic sequence of the virus and we can build viruses with that. And then we can take blood samples from patients and see how well the antibodies, which are in those blood samples from people who've been vaccinated, are able to kill the virus. And we can measure that directly in the laboratories upstairs. And we've been really doing a lot of that in the last 2 years. So some variants, so Omicron, for example, is the most extreme example of this, are less well covered by vaccines. But just to be clear what this means, we have to be very specific about what we mean by vaccines working. We know that the Omicron variant is, the infection with the Omicron variant is not as well sort of protected against with vaccines as the Wuhan variant, which first emerged in 2019. However, despite the fact that people get infected, there is 95% protection against clinically severe illness, death, and hospitalization. And so although you might get it, you're very unlikely to get a really severe infection. So at the moment, the vaccines are holding up very well as long as you've had 3 doses of the vaccine. When we give a vaccine, you're creating effectively natural immunity as well. All you're doing is instead of exposing you to the whole virus particle, we just take a little bit of it, the spike protein, which you see studding the virus particle. And if you look at the BBC News, you see the virus spinning around. And those studs are the spike protein. And so the vaccine itself is in almost every case, not quite every case, and I could talk about the rarer vaccines that are a bit different, but almost all vaccines are based on the spike protein. Our bodies think that we've been infected when they see the spike protein, and they produce natural immunity with antibodies against that spike protein. If you rely on natural immunity, it means that you're exposing yourself to the whole virus particle, and that comes with the risk of severe illness. And that's the risk. And unfortunately, I've looked after now many, many hundreds of people in the hospital, in the Queen Elizabeth Hospital here, who've had very severe COVID-19, mostly with pneumonia affecting both lungs. And most people have thought that it wouldn't happen to them because they've been otherwise quite fit and healthy. Usually the risk factor is because they're a bit older. Even people in their 30s and 40s, I've had to send to be ventilated in our intensive care unit. I don't know any infectious diseases specialist who is not vaccinated because we've seen so many people get so ill with this virus who didn't think they were at risk. I just wouldn't take the chance with natural immunity. Having said all that, I do understand vaccine hesitancy and the feeling that people have that they don't necessarily want to take a new medicine. Nobody wants to take medicines anyway. We wouldn't be throwing a vaccine at people if we didn't think it was in their best interests. The vaccine is almost always based on the spike protein, which is that protein on the surface of the virus particle that's sort of studded on the surface. That protein is really critical for the virus because that's the bit of the virus that sticks to our lung cells. The protection you get from vaccines arises from antibodies which attack that protein, that spike protein, which prevents the virus from getting into cells. And if the virus can't get into our cells in our lungs, it can't divide. And it really effectively doesn't survive. Now, the different types of vaccine are all based on this common final pathway of the spike protein and exposing us to spike protein, but they work in different ways. So you can either have a vaccine, for example, Novavax, which actually is just that protein, and that's a very traditional design of vaccine. We use that type of design for other viruses like hepatitis B, for example. And that just involves manufacturing protein in a factory somewhere and then injecting a small amount of that protein into your arm, and then you raise antibodies against it. The other types of vaccines, though, are quite different. There are two other main types of vaccine. One is what we call an mRNA vaccine. So instead, with an mRNA vaccine, what you're actually doing is injecting the recipe for the spike protein into someone's arm. And what happens in the arm is that the cells in your arm take the place of a factory outside. And so they actually read the recipe, which is in this mRNA message, and they read it and understand it and produce the spike protein themselves, and then your immune system comes and responds to that. So that's vaccines like Pfizer and Moderna. Those are based on mRNA. And then there's another type of vaccine, which is what we call a vectored vaccine, like the Oxford vaccine. That vaccine is actually based on an adenovirus, which is a common cold virus, and it's been engineered to contain a gene for the spike protein. And again, actually, it's exactly the same thing almost as the mRNA vaccines. What it is a message that's sent to the cells in your arm to produce spike protein, and then you just produce a tiny amount of spike protein only in the cells in your arm. It doesn't spread anywhere else, but you get antibodies which are formed, then you get memory antibodies, and then you remain protected for a long period of time. There is actually another type of vaccine, which you might be aware of, Valneva, which was trialled in Scotland in Livingston. That vaccine is actually whole virus vaccine. So what they do is they grow the virus in the laboratory, then they inactivate it, so it's a dead vaccine, it's not a live vaccine, and then they inject the sort of killed virus particle into you. And so that one's a bit different because that one you get antibody responses both against the spike protein and also other proteins that are part of the virus particle. And that one is an interesting one because people think that perhaps it might be more effective against some of the emerging variants. Having said that, the vaccines with the best profile are the mRNA vaccines. Yeah, there are known side effects of vaccines. They're very, very rare, but so it gets into the sort of 1 in tens of thousands type of scenario. Now, obviously, if we vaccinate the whole population, there will be a handful of people who may get side effects. Just bearing in mind, so, in an ideal world, we wouldn't have the virus and we wouldn't have to use the vaccine. Because we've got the virus, where potentially hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people could die. Having a handful of people who have side effects, but not deaths, side effects, is something that feels to me like a balance that's quite easy to make. As a doctor, I often have to talk to patients about what their best options are, and people will take really quite toxic treatments if they've got cancer and things like that. Vaccines are incredibly safe. In the spectrum of medicines and things that we use, they're very safe. Occasionally there can be side effects. You're much more likely to be run over by a bus, probably tens of times more likely to be run over by a bus. That's the sort of risk. And we don't worry about that risk when we go crossing the road. The side effects that people get generally are a bit of a sore arm, maybe feeling a bit feverish for a day or two afterwards, and a bit of a headache. easily resolvable with a couple of paracetamol tablets. That, compared with the risk of developing severe pneumonia and an intensive care admission, is for me a risk worth taking. But everyone makes their own decisions about these things. We wouldn't want to force medicines on anyone. I think we are safer now because the variant that's circulating is not as nasty as some of the previous variants. However, unfortunately, there's no guarantee that the next variant, and there will be a next variant for sure, will not be a more severe variant. And so it is important to be vaccinated. I would advise people who are hesitant about it to engage in a conversation with someone who's got the time to have a chat with them about what the risks and benefits are. And with any medicine we prescribe for any patient, there are risks and benefits. But this one is really, for me, is a no-brainer. You know, we have a virus circulating which can be very severe, particularly in older people. So if people are in the older age group, I would strongly recommend being vaccinated. The rationale for vaccinating younger people is more to protect other people in the population than yourself. And that's also important, right? We rely on younger people in the population to get vaccinated to prevent infection of people who are more vulnerable, and people who are older to stop themselves getting unwell. So there are two types for me of vaccine hesitancy. There's vaccine hesitancy where people are worried about taking a new medicine, which I think is normal and should be discussed carefully. And then there's the conspiracy theory sort of people. And the thing that concerns me about that is that there's a lot of money in it. So there's investment, and there's investment in providing treatments to people which are ineffective. And that upsets me because that can kill you. So vaccine misinformation can kill you. And that's much more of a risk than anything associated with vaccines itself.